I'm doing a series of talks for some folks on LinkedIn. And coming up this week, we're talking about CI/CD security. And I was wondering, how do you keep your CI/CD pipelines secure? Like, what are some of the practices that you implement out of the gate for your CI/CD pipelines?
Yeah, that's a good one. If we're talking about GitHub Actions, there's some very specific things you should do about securing those workflows. A lot of thoughts on this, and I'm not sure if I can collect them all at the same time, but for GitHub Actions, there's a lot of things that I think companies choose maybe not to go deeper on to fully understand and are setting themselves up for problems. So most companies, by and large, use GitHub for Teams, which I didn't realize how much it was really a team product. And what do I mean by that? In Teams, everyone's an admin. We follow a certain practice to merge pull requests, and we can enable branch protections and so forth. But workflows can run on any branch and access anything that's a secret. In that sense, there's not a modicum of security around secrets in a team environment using GitHub for Teams. Your pull requests and your pull request workflows, let's say you're implementing GitOps with GitHub Actions, you're using maybe GitHub OIDC to assume roles in AWS. So that's a step up. I mean, a lot of companies are using secrets, and I just explained that those secrets are not even secret. So let's say you're using GitHub OIDC. If that GitHub OIDC principle is not locked down to the branch of the repository, anyone that can create a branch in that repository has full access to whatever permissions of that GitHub OIDC integration. So that's like giving any developer administrative access. They can open a branch or PR. Using pull request target is one of the mitigations for that instead of using pull request events. But when you start using pull request target, it's really annoying to develop workflows and pipelines because you got to merge it into main in order to even test it. Or you got to change your default temporarily to your branch, which means it's only for GitHub admins of that repo anyways.
Or use Act if it's one of the things that you can run in Act.
Yeah, and then there's ACT, right? But ACT, I mean, yeah, it's probably come a lot further.
It's gotten better, yeah.
But one of the problems with ACT is you can frequently come up with workflows that work in ACT that don't work in GitHub Actions, vice versa.
Or vice versa. Yeah. Especially things that use like the cache and stuff like that.
Yeah.
They break in ACT.
In GitHub for Teams, if you have write access to the repo, we're not talking open source at this point because generally contributors, unless they're part of the project itself, don't have that. And we're not talking about write access to the fork. We're talking about write access to the target of that fork, so to say. Any branch has access to the secrets. And the only way to fix that is, well, you don't use secrets, or B, you use GitHub Enterprise. So GitHub Enterprise adds the construct of environments and protection rules for environments that restrict those to specific branches. And that's the way you get security. So this was kind of just the epiphany I had in the past year, and realizing that you can't really implement secure CI/CD on GitHub without GitHub Enterprise. And that's why you have to pay for it.
I feel like I've seen no one who does a really good job of this is like auditing and logging and monitoring of the pipelines themselves. Everyone just kind of does it, and whatever the GitHub UI says is what it says, but there isn't any kind of like correlation and centralized logging and, whatever, like automated rules that are looking at things that look suspicious in CI. Because a lot of the things that we've talked about could be picked up if we had a good SIEM tool around like CI/CD in particular. So I think that's an area to look for to improve. And then zero trust. Don't trust that anything coming in or out of your pipeline isn't or hasn't been compromised. And if you try to think of it that way, you'll start to be cynical and you'll start to find ways to make it more secure.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on that because after investigating this a lot, it's changed my opinion about using things from the marketplace, for instance, right? If you really want to go really deep into security for your CI/CD, then often end up just wanting to write everything yourself, which is also painful in its own way. But if you're going to keep using actions, it's good to pin them specific versions. That's one good thing. I think another thing GitHub specific as well is like using that permissions thing in the YAML to limit the permissions of the GitHub token.
That's a good point.
A lot of people overlook that, and it's a simple fix. The one other thing I wanted to say is, and this one is probably the hardest, is at the end of the day, if your actions are connected to your infrastructure, for instance in AWS, You can do a lot to protect the actions, but you also have to think about what permissions the role has. And once someone has access to that, then they can do a lot of things, right? So let's say someone is able to actually compromise your pipeline, and the role that the runner is running or the OIDC has like God mode, then they can just, get persistence. And that's the really hard part, because especially for those of us building infrastructure, it can be very painful to like scope down a role to just what is needed to set up the infrastructure. I have not seen anyone do it properly or like do it well. And I don't know that there is a good solution either.
Yeah, you bring up a good point about self-hosted runners and that they basically should not be used with public repos.
Cool. Thanks for this. And I will pick up a couple. Some that overlap with the very short list that I had was like securing the CI/CD environment, limiting access control, protecting secret. Like that top three basically are some of the main ones that I wanted to cover. To your point, Eric, I thought about a couple of the points that you mentioned. Number one, like you're in a team environment and you accept that PR from somebody who is not part of your team. I think this is one of your points. It was like maybe a Slack discussion some while back about accepting PRs from people who aren't a part of your team, but then once their PR is accepted, they somehow kind of become part of your team or something like that. Like maybe their PRs aren't subject to review, or I forget what the case is, but anyway, their PR runs have access to your secrets and your pipelines.
All right, well, that brings us to the end of the hour. Thanks everyone for participating. Those were some great questions.